Most people think the moment a life falls apart is loud, but sometimes it's quiet. The first thing Dr. Carter noticed that night wasn't the alarms or the nurses rushing past him in the emergency room. Hospitals are always loud. That part wasn't unusual. What caught his attention was the way the husband was standing. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't even looking at the doctors working on his wife. He was just standing there, hands folded together, eyes fixed on the floor, like he was trying very hard not to think. Dr. Carter had worked enough overnight shifts to recognize the different kinds of fear people carry into an emergency room. Some people cry. Some people panic. Some people pray under their breath. But this man, Williams, looked like someone waiting for news he had already prepared himself to hear. The patient they had rushed in was a woman named Eunice. 6 months pregnant, she had collapsed in her kitchen, according to her husband. By the time the ambulance brought her in, she was barely conscious. A nurse was checking the baby's heartbeat, while another started and forth. The room moved fast, the way emergency rooms always do when there are 2 lives on the line. For a moment, things looked like they might stabilize. Then the lab results came back. Dr. Carter was standing at the computer when the toxicology panel appeared on the screen. He frowned. At first he thought the system had made a mistake. He refreshed the chart. Same result. A rare toxin was present in Eunice's bloodstream. Not something you pick up from spoiled food. Not something that shows up from a medication error. This was the kind of substance that didn't appear unless someone had deliberately put it there. Dr. Carter leaned back slowly in his chair. In 20 years of practicing medicine, he had seen accidents, overdoses, even cases of abuse. But poisoning a pregnant woman? That was something else entirely. He looked back toward the hallway where Williams was waiting. The man finally lifted his head as Dr. Carter stepped out of the room. For a split second their eyes met, and something about the look on Williams' face didn't sit right. It wasn't shock. It wasn't fear. If anything, it looked closer to calculation. Dr. Carter didn't say anything right away, but in that moment, a quiet question settled in the back of his mind. If someone had poisoned Eunice, who had access to her food, who had been close enough to her to do it slowly, without raising suspicion, and why would anyone want a pregnant woman dead? That question would eventually unravel a truth far uglier than anyone in that hospital expected. But to understand how it all happened, you have to go back a little further, back to the kind of life that, from the outside, looked like it was finally coming together. Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from, and subscribe to officially join the family. The ambulance doors hadn't even fully closed before the paramedics started shouting instructions. 6 months pregnant, possible loss of consciousness, pulse unstable. We need OB on standby. The gurney wheels rattled across the emergency room floor as 2 nurses rushed forward to meet them. One of them pushed the swinging doors open with her shoulder, while the other was already snapping on gloves. Inside the trauma room, the lights were brighter than anywhere else in the hospital. White, harsh, the kind that made everything feel urgent. Eunice lay on the stretcher barely moving, her breathing shallow. Her long braids were damp with sweat and stuck to the side of her face. Someone had placed an oxygen mask over her mouth, but even through the clear plastic you could see how pale she had become. "Let's move her over," one of the nurses said quickly. 3 people lifted her carefully from the ambulance stretcher to the hospital bed. A monitor beeped to life beside her. Another nurse began wrapping a blood pressure cuff around her arm while someone else adjusted the oxygen flow. "Where's the fetal monitor?" a voice asked from the corner. A younger nurse rushed over with the machine and began positioning the sensors against Eunice's stomach. Everyone in the room knew the unspoken truth. This wasn't just one patient. There were 2 lives on that bed. Outside the room, Williams stood near the wall with his hands clasped together. A nurse had asked him to wait there while the team worked. He nodded when they told him, but he hadn't moved since. He kept staring at the floor tiles, white and gray squares arranged in perfect rows. It gave him something to focus on besides the sounds coming from inside the room. Monitors beeping, doctors speaking in quick, clipped sentences, footsteps rushing in and out. Every few seconds someone would push through the curtains separating the trauma room from the hallway. Each time the curtain moved, Williams glanced up briefly, then his eyes dropped again. A few feet away, a tall man in a navy blue coat stepped out of another room and checked the chart in his hands. Dr. Carter had just finished seeing another patient when the paramedics rolled Eunice through the doors. Emergency rooms were unpredictable places. 1 minute things were calm. The next minute chaos rolled in on a stretcher. He watched the team for a moment through the glass window before stepping inside. "What do we have?" he asked. The paramedic answered quickly. "Female, 28, 6 months pregnant. Husband says she collapsed in the kitchen about 20 minutes ago. She's been dizzy and weak for a few days." "Doctor," Carter nodded. "Vitals, blood pressure dropping when we picked her up. Pulse irregular." "Doctor," Carter moved closer to the bed. Eunice's eyelids fluttered slightly as he shined a small light toward her eyes. "Eunice?" he said calmly. No response. The nurse monitoring the baby finally spoke. "I'm getting a heartbeat." Everyone in the room paused for a fraction of a second. Then the steady rhythm filled the air. Thump, 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 thump. Not strong, but present. "Good," Dr. Carter said quietly. He turned toward another nurse. "Let's get blood work started. Full panel. Toxicology, too." The nurse nodded and began preparing the vials. As they worked, Dr. Carter studied Eunice's face for a moment. Something about the situation didn't quite add up. Pregnancy complications could cause dizziness, even fainting sometimes. But the paramedic's report bothered him. "She's been dizzy for days." "That's what the husband said," the paramedic confirmed. Dr. Carter glanced toward the hallway where Williams was waiting. Through the open curtain he could see him standing there, still motionless, still staring down. Dr. Carter had seen plenty of worried spouses before. Most of them asked questions every few seconds. "Is she okay? Is the baby okay? What's happening?" But this man hadn't said anything. Not yet. Dr. Carter pushed the thought aside for the moment. There would be time to talk to him later. Right now, Eunice needed to stabilize. The nurse finished drawing blood and rushed the samples out to the lab. Another nurse adjusted the fourth. For the next 20 minutes, the room moved with quiet intensity. Gradually, Eunice's breathing steadied. Her pulse became less erratic. Dr. Carter finally stepped back from the bedside. "Let's monitor her closely," he said, "and page OB just to be safe." The team nodded. One by one, they stepped out of the room to handle other patients waiting in the ER. Dr. Carter removed his gloves and walked toward the hallway. Williams looked up as he approached. For a moment, neither man spoke. "You're her husband, doctor?" Carter asked. Williams nodded quickly. "Yes." "Williams." Dr. Carter kept his voice calm. "Right now she's stable. The baby has a heartbeat, which is a good sign." Williams exhaled slowly, like someone releasing air he had been holding for a long time. "Thank God," he murmured. Dr. Carter studied him quietly. "Can you tell me what happened tonight?" Williams ran a hand through his hair. "She was in the kitchen. I was in the living room finishing some paperwork. I heard something fall." His voice trembled slightly. "When I got there, she was on the floor. Had she complained about anything earlier?" "Doctor," Carter asked. Williams hesitated for just a moment. "She's been feeling tired, dizzy sometimes." "How long?" "Maybe a week." Dr. Carter nodded slowly. "Has she taken any new medications recently?" "No." "Anything unusual in her diet? Supplements, herbal remedies?" Williams shook his head. "No." Dr. Carter made a mental note of the answers. "All right," he said. "We've sent her blood to the lab. That should help us understand what's going on." Williams nodded again, though his eyes drifted briefly toward the trauma room. For the first time since arriving, he looked nervous. Not the kind of nervous people feel when they're afraid for someone they love. Something else. Something tighter, like someone waiting for a result they couldn't control. Dr. Carter noticed the look, but he said nothing. Instead, he walked down the hallway toward the nurses' station where the lab reports would arrive. The emergency room had settled back into its usual rhythm. Phones ringing, monitors chiming, nurses moving quickly between rooms. 10 minutes passed. Then a printer near the desk began spitting out pages. A lab technician handed the results to Dr. Carter. "Blood work came back already," she said. He thanked her and started scanning the page. Electrolytes, white blood cells, platelet count. Everything looked mostly normal at first glance. Then his eyes reached the toxicology section. He frowned. Something there didn't belong. He leaned closer to the page. Maybe he had misread it. He checked again. The same result stared back at him. A rare toxin, detected in Eunice's bloodstream. Dr. Carter's expression slowly changed. Poison. He flipped the page to confirm the levels. Not enough to kill instantly, but enough to slowly weaken the body. Enough to make someone dizzy. Enough to cause collapse. His mind immediately started running through possibilities. Accidental exposure? Highly unlikely. This substance didn't appear in household products. It wasn't something someone would encounter by chance, which meant one thing. Someone had given it to her. Dr. Carter slowly lowered the paper. Then he turned his head toward the trauma room. Through the hallway, he could see Williams again. Still standing in the same spot. Still waiting. Dr. Carter watched him for a moment. Something about the man's posture tightened his instincts. Doctors develop a sense for when things don't feel right. And right now, nothing about this situation felt right. Dr. Carter folded the lab report quietly. Then he walked back toward the room where Eunice lay unconscious. Because the question forming in his mind was one he couldn't ignore. If someone had poisoned a pregnant woman, who had been close enough to do it? Long before that night in the hospital, before the machines and the quiet suspicion forming in Dr. Carter's mind, Eunice had built a life people in her neighborhood used as an example. Not the flashy kind of success people show off on social media. The steady kind. The kind that comes from waking up early for years and refusing to quit, even when things get difficult. Eunice grew up on the south side of Atlanta in a small brick house that had been in her family since the early 1980s. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. Paint peeled from some of the older houses, and on summer nights you could sometimes hear distant sirens echoing down the main road. But it was also the kind of place where people looked out for each other. Miss Gloria from across the street watched everybody's kids like they were her own. Mr. Henderson cut the grass for 3 houses on the block every Saturday morning, whether anyone asked him to or not. And every Sunday morning the entire street seemed to wake up at the same time. Church mornings had their own rhythm. Women stepping outside in bright dresses and wide hats. Kids complaining about itchy clothes. The smell of someone frying chicken before noon. Eunice grew up surrounded by that kind of life. But inside her house, things were often quieter. Her mother, Lorraine, worked 2 jobs most of Eunice's childhood. During the day she worked in the cafeteria of a nearby elementary school. At night she cleaned offices and hospital floors long after most people had gone home. Eunice remembered many nights falling asleep on the couch while waiting for her mother's car to pull into the driveway. Lorraine would walk in sometime after midnight, tired but still smiling. She would lean down and kiss Eunice on the forehead. "You still up, baby?" she'd whisper. Sometimes Eunice pretended to be asleep anyway, just so her mother wouldn't feel bad. Money had never come easy in their household, but Lorraine had one belief she repeated so often it became part of Eunice's thinking. "Baby, nobody is coming to save you," she would say while tying her work shoes before leaving for another shift. "You save yourself." Eunice carried those words with her for the rest of her life. Even when things got hard, especially when things got hard. By the time she reached her 20s, that mindset had turned into something powerful. While some of her friends bounced between jobs, Eunice stayed focused. She worked part-time during college, studied business management, and spent long nights researching industries that actually needed reliable workers. That's when she noticed something most people overlooked. Atlanta had thousands of elderly residents who needed home care. Simple things: medication reminders, help bathing, transportation to doctor's appointments. Families needed trustworthy caregivers, but often didn't know where to find them. Eunice saw the opportunity. At 25, she used her savings to start a small home health assistance service. At first, it was just her, driving across the city to help clients herself, checking on elderly patients whose families lived out of state, cooking simple meals, making sure medications were taken on time. Word spread quickly. People trusted Eunice. She showed up when she said she would. She listened. She treated people's parents and grandparents with respect. Within 3 years, the business had grown into something much bigger than she originally imagined. She hired her first employee, then another, then 5 more. By 28, Eunice had built a small but thriving agency that served multiple neighborhoods across Atlanta. It didn't make her wealthy, but it gave her something better: stability. She was able to help her mother finally retire from night cleaning shifts. She bought a modest townhouse not far from where she grew up. And most importantly, she had proven Lorraine's words right. Nobody had saved her. She had built her own way forward. But even strong people feel lonely sometimes. Most evenings, after finishing work calls and scheduling caregivers for the next day, Eunice sat alone at the small wooden table by her kitchen window. Outside, the Atlanta skyline glowed softly in the distance. Some nights she cooked full meals. Other nights she just warmed leftovers and ate quietly while scrolling through her phone. Those were the moments she usually called Kayla. Kayla had been her best friend since their freshman year of college. They met in the most ordinary way. Kayla had walked up to Eunice in the campus library one afternoon, holding a nearly dead phone. "Excuse me," Kayla said with a grin. "You look responsible. Do you happen to have a charger?" Eunice laughed. "Responsible?" Kayla nodded confidently. "You got that organized notebook look." Eunice handed her the charger. Kayla sat down across from her, and never really stopped talking after that. Where Eunice was calm and thoughtful, Kayla was loud and expressive. She laughed easily. She told dramatic stories about dates that went wrong. She spoke her mind even when people didn't ask for her opinion. But underneath all that energy, Kayla had a way of making people feel seen. She showed up for birthdays. She checked on Eunice during stressful weeks. And when life felt heavy, Kayla had a way of pulling Eunice out of her thoughts. One evening, years later, Eunice sat at her kitchen table with the phone pressed between her ear and shoulder while stirring a pot of soup. Kayla's voice filled the room. "So, let me get this straight," Kayla said. "You got your own business, your mama finally retired, and you got a whole townhouse to yourself." Eunice smiled. "When you say it like that, it sounds fancy." "It is fancy," Kayla replied. Eunice laughed softly. "It's quiet." There was a short pause. Kayla knew exactly what that meant. "You're thinking about the relationship thing again, aren't you?" Eunice didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she finally said. "Sometimes it feels like everyone else figured that part out already." Kayla groaned dramatically through the phone. "Girl, please. You just haven't met the right man yet." Eunice shook her head with a small smile. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," Kayla insisted. "You just need someone who can keep up with you." Eunice turned off the stove and leaned against the counter. Maybe. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. She had spent most of her life being the responsible one, the strong one, the person others depended on. Sometimes she wondered what it would feel like to finally meet someone she could depend on too. Someone steady, someone calm, someone who made life feel less like a constant uphill climb. She didn't know it yet, but that person was about to walk into her life in the most ordinary way possible. In a hospital hallway, during an argument about a billing mistake, and for a while, it would feel like she had finally found the safe place she'd been looking for. The day Eunice met Williams started out like any other workday. Her phone had already rung 3 times before she even finished her morning coffee. One caregiver needed to swap shifts. Another client's daughter wanted to add an extra visit for her father that week. And one of her elderly patients, Mr. Davenport, had an appointment at the hospital that Eunice insisted on attending herself. Mr. Davenport was 82 years old and stubborn in the way old men sometimes are when they've lived long enough to feel like nobody should be telling them what to do. "You don't have to come with me," he said while Eunice helped him out of the car that morning. "I know I don't," she replied. "Then why are you?" "Because last time you forgot to tell the doctor you stopped taking your medication." Mr. Davenport frowned. "That medicine makes me sleepy, and not taking it makes your blood pressure dangerous," Eunice said calmly. He muttered something under his breath but allowed her to guide him inside. Hospitals always carried a certain kind of tension in the air. Even when things were calm, people moved quickly. Conversations were quiet. Everyone seemed aware that serious things happened in places like this. After Mr. Davenport's appointment, Eunice walked with him toward the billing desk near the exit. The woman behind the counter handed over the paperwork without much expression. Eunice scanned the receipt. Then she looked up again. "This medication charge is wrong," she said politely. The clerk barely glanced at the page. "That's the standard rate." Eunice shook her head. "No, it's not. This prescription is covered under his insurance plan." The clerk sighed the way someone does when they've already decided they don't want to deal with the conversation. That's what the system shows. Eunice remained calm, but she didn't step away. "I understand what the system says," she replied. "But the policy clearly states—" The clerk interrupted her. "Ma'am, if you want to dispute the charge, you'll need to file a billing request form." Eunice folded her arms. I'm not filing paperwork for something that can be corrected in 2 minutes. Mr. Davenport leaned slightly closer to her. You getting ready to argue again, ain't you? He whispered. Eunice didn't take her eyes off the clerk. I'm getting ready to fix something. The conversation had drawn a little attention from people passing by in the hallway. That's when a calm voice spoke behind her. Excuse me. What seems to be the issue? Eunice turned. Standing there was a man wearing dark scrubs with a stethoscope hanging loosely around his neck. His hair looked slightly messy, like someone who had either rushed through the morning or hadn't slept much. But his eyes were steady, focused. He looked between Eunice and the clerk with quiet curiosity. The clerk straightened slightly. Dr. Williams, she said quickly. It's nothing, just a billing question. Williams stepped closer. Mind if I take a look? The clerk hesitated, then slid the paper toward him. He studied the receipt for less than 30 seconds. Then he opened the patient chart on the computer beside the desk. A few more clicks. He leaned back slightly. This medication should be covered, he said calmly. The clerk blinked, but the system was entered incorrectly. Williams finished. He adjusted something on the screen. The total on the receipt changed, just like that. Mr. Davenport leaned over the counter to look. Well, I'll be, he said. The clerk forced a small smile and printed a new receipt. Sorry about that. Eunice took the corrected paperwork and turned toward Williams. Thank you, she said. He shrugged lightly. You were already halfway to solving it yourself. She smiled. It wasn't a practiced smile, just a genuine one that reached her eyes. Williams noticed immediately. You work in healthcare? He asked. Home care services, she replied. I run a small agency. He nodded with interest. That explains why you were ready to argue hospital policy. I prefer the word advocate, Eunice said. Williams chuckled. Mr. Davenport leaned closer again. You single? He asked Williams bluntly. Eunice looked at him. Mr. Davenport. What? He said. I'm old, not blind. Williams laughed. I am single. Mr. Davenport nodded approvingly. Good. This one here works too hard. Eunice shook her head, embarrassed. Please ignore him. But Williams didn't seem bothered. In fact, something about the moment felt unexpectedly easy. Before Eunice could gather Mr. Davenport's things and leave, Williams spoke again. Would it be strange if I asked you to get coffee sometime? Eunice blinked slightly. The question caught her off guard, not because she wasn't interested, but because life had taught her to be careful. Trust wasn't something she handed out easily. She studied him for a moment. He didn't look like someone trying too hard to impress her. No flashy confidence, no rehearsed charm, just a tired doctor standing in a hospital hallway hoping she might say yes. Coffee is fine, she said finally. Williams smiled. For the first time that day, he looked fully awake. Their first few dates were simple. Coffee shops where neither of them felt rushed to leave. Walks through Piedmont Park after work when the evening air cooled the city down. Long conversations about family, about growing up, about the different ways people learn resilience. Williams had grown up in a quiet suburb outside Charlotte. His father worked as an engineer. His mother had been a school principal for nearly 30 years. Dinner happened every evening at 6 o'clock sharp. Problems were discussed calmly around the kitchen table. Eunice listened with curiosity. Her childhood had looked very different. Her home had been louder, more chaotic, more crowded, cousins sleeping on couches during family visits, neighbors knocking on the door without calling first, church choir rehearsals stretching late into the evening. Williams seemed fascinated by it. One night while they sat on a park bench watching the city lights flicker in the distance, he asked her something unexpected. Do you ever get tired of being the strong one? Eunice looked at him. Nobody had ever asked her that before. Not directly. People praised her work ethic. They admired her business. But they rarely asked what it felt like to carry so much responsibility. She looked down at her hands for a moment. Yeah, she admitted quietly. Williams didn't rush to respond. He didn't offer advice. He didn't try to fix anything. He simply listened. That small moment changed something inside Eunice. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she didn't have to hold everything together by herself. 2 years later, they stood together in a small church surrounded by friends and family. Lorraine sat in the front row dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Kayla stood beside Eunice as maid of honor, whispering jokes that made Eunice laugh even during the ceremony. When the pastor asked if anyone objected to the marriage, Kayla leaned slightly toward Eunice. "If somebody stands up right now," she whispered, "I will personally escort them outside." Eunice nearly laughed out loud. But when Williams took her hands and repeated his vows, the moment felt steady, safe, like two people choosing to build something real together. Later that night during the reception, Kayla pulled Eunice aside near the dance floor. "Girl," she said, smiling, "you really found a good one." Eunice looked across the room at Williams laughing with her uncles. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt stable, predictable in the best possible way. For a while, their life together stayed that way. Williams worked long shifts at the hospital. Eunice expanded her business into 2 additional counties. They argued sometimes about small things, schedules, money decisions, normal marriage stuff, but the foundation of their relationship seemed strong. Then one quiet evening changed everything. Eunice sat on the couch holding a small plastic test in her hand. 2 pink lines. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked up at Williams. "I think we're having a baby." For a moment he just stared at the test. Then he pulled her into the tightest hug she had ever felt. "I'm going to be a dad," he whispered. Eunice laughed softly through happy tears. For the first time in her life, everything felt like it was finally falling into place. She didn't know that somewhere behind the stability of that life, cracks had already begun to form, and the 2 people she trusted most were standing right at the center of them. For the first few weeks after Eunice told Williams she was pregnant, their house felt different. Not dramatically different, just softer, like both of them had quietly stepped into a new phase of life and were still figuring out how to move around inside it. Eunice noticed it in small ways. Williams started coming home with random things from the pharmacy aisle at the hospital. Ginger tea, prenatal vitamins she hadn't asked for. Once he brought home a tiny pair of baby socks he claimed had been on sale. "They were $2, he said defensively when she laughed. $2 for something the baby won't wear for months," Eunice replied. Williams shrugged. "I panicked in the baby section." Eunice smiled and tucked the socks into the kitchen drawer anyway. For the first few months, the pregnancy felt almost unreal. Eunice still woke up early most mornings, answering emails from caregivers and coordinating client schedules before the day fully started. Her home health agency had grown enough that she didn't have to handle every visit personally anymore, but she still liked staying involved. She believed businesses stayed strong when the owner stayed close to the work. But pregnancy had a way of reminding her that her body had its own plans. Some mornings she woke up feeling perfectly fine. Other mornings she could barely make it through breakfast without feeling nauseous. Williams tried to help where he could. He cooked more often. He insisted she sit down when she started moving too quickly around the house. "You're not running a marathon," he told her one evening, while gently taking a grocery bag out of her hands. "I've been lifting heavier things than this for years," Eunice said. "Yeah, but now there's a tiny human involved." She rolled her eyes but allowed him to carry the groceries inside. For a while, those little moments made the pregnancy feel like a shared adventure. Then work began pulling Williams away more often. Hospitals were unpredictable places. Some weeks his schedule stayed normal. Other weeks he came home exhausted from long shifts and unexpected emergencies. One night Eunice woke up around 2 in the morning and realized he still wasn't home. She checked her phone. A short message waited. "Emergency surgery ran late. Don't wait up." She placed the phone back on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a while. She understood his work. Healthcare didn't follow convenient schedules. Still, the house felt quieter on nights like that. That's when Kayla started showing up more often. It wasn't unusual at first. Kayla had always been the type of friend who stopped by without much warning. One afternoon, Eunice heard a knock at the door while she was finishing a phone call with a caregiver. When she opened it, Kayla stood there holding a grocery bag and wearing sunglasses pushed up on top of her head. "Pregnant women require supervision," Kayla announced. Eunice laughed. "Since when?" "Since right now." Kayla walked past her into the kitchen like she owned the place. "What's in the bag?" Eunice asked. "Soup ingredients." Kayla began unpacking vegetables and broth containers onto the counter. "I Googled what pregnant women are supposed to eat." "That's slightly concerning," Eunice said. Kayla pointed a carrot at her. "You're welcome." Soon those visits became routine. Kayla stopped by 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she just sat on the couch talking while Eunice finished work emails. Other times she insisted on helping with small things around the house. "You're not supposed to be bending over cleaning floors," Kayla said one afternoon while grabbing a mop from the closet. "I wasn't bending over," Eunice replied. Kayla gave her a look. "You were about to." Eunice sat down on the couch while Kayla mopped the kitchen floor with exaggerated determination. "You know," Eunice said, "most people just visit pregnant women. They don't reorganize their entire house." Kayla shrugged. "I'm being supportive." She paused, then added casually, "Plus, Williams works like 80 hours a week." Eunice tilted her head slightly. "It's not 80. Kayla smirked. "Feels like it." Eunice couldn't really argue with that. Over the next few weeks, Kayla's presence in the house started to feel normal. Sometimes she arrived while Williams was still at work. Other times she stayed long enough that he returned home while she was still there. The three of them occasionally ate dinner together. Kayla filled the room with her usual energy, telling stories about coworkers or random people she encountered during the day. Williams mostly listened. He laughed when appropriate, asked polite questions. From the outside, nothing about those evenings seemed unusual, but pregnancy also began changing how Eunice felt physically. Around the 4th month, the fatigue started getting stronger, not the normal kind of tired she had experienced during the early weeks. This felt heavier, like her body was constantly running out of energy no matter how much she slept. One afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table reviewing caregiver schedules when a wave of dizziness forced her to close her eyes. The room spun for a moment. She placed both hands on the table until the feeling passed. Kayla noticed immediately. "You okay?" Eunice opened her eyes again. "Yeah, just lightheaded." Kayla frowned. "Did you eat today?" "Of course I did." "What?" Eunice thought for a second. "Toast and fruit." Kayla crossed her arms. "That's not enough food for someone growing a human." "I had soup yesterday," Eunice added defensively. Kayla shook her head. "I'm making you lunch." Before Eunice could protest, Kayla was already moving around the kitchen opening cabinets. Within minutes she had pulled out ingredients and started assembling a quick meal. Eunice watched from the table. "You really don't have to do all this." Kayla glanced over her shoulder. "Yes, I do." She placed a glass of juice in front of Eunice. "Drink that." Eunice obeyed with a small smile. "You've become very bossy lately." Kayla grinned. "Pregnancy supervisor." Eunice finished the juice while Kayla cooked. At the time, nothing about the moment seemed strange. Friends helped each other. That's what Kayla had always done. Still, the dizziness didn't fully disappear. Over the next few weeks, Eunice noticed it happening more often. Some mornings she woke up feeling strangely weak. Other days her stomach cramped in ways that didn't feel like normal pregnancy discomfort. Williams encouraged her to schedule extra checkups. "Just to be safe," he said. Doctors monitored her closely, but most of them gave the same explanation. Pregnancy affects everyone differently. Fatigue, hormonal changes, occasional dizziness. Nothing they saw during routine exams suggested serious danger. So Eunice kept going, running her business, preparing the spare bedroom that would soon become a nursery, accepting Kayla's help when it appeared at her door, and trusting that the people closest to her wanted the best for her and the baby. What she couldn't see yet was that the first cracks in her life weren't forming because of pregnancy. They were forming because of secrets that had already begun growing quietly between the two people she trusted the most. And those secrets were about to change everything. The first time the line between Kayla and Williams shifted, it didn't feel like a betrayal. At least not at first. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Eunice had gone to bed early after spending most of the afternoon dealing with paperwork for her agency. Pregnancy had been draining more energy from her lately, and by 9 o'clock she could barely keep her eyes open. William stayed downstairs in the living room finishing notes from his shift at the hospital. Around 10, there was a knock at the door. Williams assumed it was a delivery driver or maybe a neighbor. But when he opened it, Kayla stood there holding a takeout bag. "Did I miss dinner?" she asked. Williams stepped aside so she could come in. "You're just in time for leftovers." Kayla kicked off her shoes near the door, like she had done 100 times before. "Where's Eunice?" "Sleeping." Kayla nodded. "Good. She needs it." She placed the takeout bag on the kitchen counter and leaned back against it. "You look tired," she said, studying Williams. "Long shift," he replied. Kayla laughed softly. "You always say that." "Well, it's usually true." She opened the bag and started pulling out containers. I brought dumplings, figured everyone could eat. Williams glanced toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. She probably won't wake up. Kayla shrugged. Then, we'll eat them. The two of them sat at the kitchen island with the open containers between them. For a few minutes they ate quietly. Then Kayla started talking. She had always been the kind of person who filled silence easily. Do you ever feel like adulthood is just surviving your job every day? She asked. Williams chuckled. Depends on the day. Kayla stirred her noodles with a chopstick. My boss gave a 2-hour meeting today about improving workplace morale. And did it improve morale? Williams asked. Not even a little. Williams laughed. Kayla smiled slightly. You know what's funny? She said. What? You and Eunice are the only people I know who seem like they actually have things figured out. Williams shook his head. We definitely don't. Kayla tilted her head. Really? Marriage is work, he said. So is everything else. Kayla watched him for a moment. You're good for her, she said finally. Williams looked up. I try to be. Kayla leaned back in her chair. She deserves someone steady. The conversation shifted after that. They talked about work, about Atlanta traffic, about random things that didn't matter. But when Kayla stood up to leave later that night, something about the air between them felt slightly different. Not wrong, just different. The second time the line shifted, it lasted longer. It happened a few weeks later. Eunice had a prenatal appointment scheduled across town, and Kayla had offered to drive her. Williams had already left for the hospital early that morning. The appointment took longer than expected. Routine tests, more waiting. By the time Eunice returned home, she looked exhausted. I'm going to take a nap, she said, as soon as she stepped inside. Kayla nodded. Good idea. Eunice disappeared down the hallway toward the bedroom. Kayla stayed in the living room scrolling through her phone. About 20 minutes later, the front door opened. William stepped inside quietly, surprised to see her there. You're back early, Kayla said. Patient canceled last minute, he replied. He loosened his tie slightly and dropped his keys on the table. How'd the appointment go? Kayla shrugged. Doctor says everything looks normal. Williams nodded. That's good. There was a pause. Kayla studied him for a moment. You look stressed. He sighed. Hospital's been rough lately. Kayla leaned forward slightly. You can vent if you want. Williams hesitated. Then he sat down across from her. I lost a patient last night, he said quietly. Kayla's expression softened. Oh, complications after surgery, he continued. We did everything right, but sometimes it still doesn't work. Kayla nodded slowly. That must be hard. It's part of the job, Williams said, but his voice sounded tired. Kayla watched him for a moment longer. You don't always have to pretend you're okay, she said gently. Williams looked up. For a second, neither of them spoke. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then Kayla stood up. Come on, she said. Where? Kitchen. He followed her. Kayla opened the cabinet and pulled out 2 glasses. What are we doing? He asked. Having a drink. I'm on call tonight. Kayla paused. Right. She set the glasses back down. Tea then. Williams laughed quietly. You're very determined. Kayla poured 2 cups anyway. They sat at the kitchen table sipping the tea while the afternoon sunlight filtered through the window. The conversation drifted again. Work stress. Childhood stories. Small complaints about adult responsibilities. By the time Eunice woke up 2 hours later, she walked into the kitchen and found them laughing about something neither of them bothered to explain. She smiled. It made her happy seeing the 2 most important people in her life getting along. She had no reason to question it. Weeks passed. Kayla kept visiting. Williams kept working long shifts. And slowly, almost invisibly, the boundaries between them softened. More conversations when Eunice went to bed early. More shared jokes. More quiet moments in the kitchen when the house was still. Then one night something finally crossed the line. It happened after a small dinner gathering at their house. A few of Eunice's relatives had come over to celebrate the pregnancy. There had been laughter, food, and too many people squeezed into the living room. By the time everyone left, Eunice was exhausted. She kissed Williams goodnight and went straight to bed. Kayla stayed behind to help clean up. Dishes stacked in the sink, empty plates on the counter. Williams dried glasses while Kayla wiped the table. You don't have to stay this late, he said. Kayla shrugged. I don't mind. They finished cleaning. The kitchen grew quiet again. Kayla leaned against the counter. You're a good husband, she said. Williams looked up. I try. Kayla studied him carefully. You know, most men wouldn't handle all this responsibility the way you do. What responsibility? Work, marriage, a baby on the way. Williams shrugged. You just deal with it. Kayla stepped a little closer. And if you ever felt overwhelmed, I'd figure it out. She held his gaze. Would you? Something in the air shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. Williams should have stepped back. Kayla should have walked toward the door. Instead, they both stayed where they were. One moment stretched into another. Then Kayla leaned forward slightly, and everything changed. What happened next wasn't a long, dramatic affair. It was one quiet mistake, one decision neither of them stopped. And once a line like that is crossed, it becomes easier to cross again. By the time either of them fully understood what they had done, the damage had already begun. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. The worst part was that Eunice still trusted them both completely, and she had no idea that the two people standing closest to her life were already starting to build secrets behind her back. For a while after that night in the kitchen, both Kayla and Williams tried to behave like nothing had changed, at least when Eunice was around. If anyone had walked into the house during those weeks, they would have seen the same things they had always seen. Kayla dropping by with groceries, Williams coming home late from the hospital, Eunice sitting at the kitchen table planning caregiver schedules for her agency. The same conversations, the same routine. But beneath the surface, something had shifted in a way neither of them could completely undo. At first, Kayla avoided being alone with Williams. If she came over and he was already home, she kept her distance. Short conversations, polite smiles, nothing that looked suspicious. Williams did the same. He buried himself in work, picked up extra shifts, came home late enough that Eunice was already asleep most nights. Both of them understood the silent rule. What happened once wasn't supposed to happen again. But silence has a strange way of pulling people back toward the thing they're trying to avoid. It started with small moments. A glance across the room that lasted half a second too long. A conversation that drifted into something more personal. One evening, Kayla arrived while Eunice was finishing a video call with one of her agency supervisors. Williams had just returned from the hospital and was pouring a glass of water in the kitchen. Kayla stepped inside and stopped when she saw him standing there. Hey, she said quietly. Hey. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Eunice's voice drifted from the other room. Kayla, that you? Kayla quickly stepped further inside. Yeah. She walked straight into the living room, leaving Williams alone in the kitchen. Moments like that happened more often. Moments where the memory of that night sat quietly between them. Neither of them addressed it directly, but neither of them forgot. The second time it happened was less accidental. It was late again. Eunice had gone to bed early after complaining about feeling unusually tired that day. Kayla was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone when Williams walked in. You're still here? He asked. Kayla shrugged. I was about to leave. He opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Kayla said something that surprised even herself. You ever think about how strange life is? Williams looked at her. In what way? Kayla rested her chin on her hand. How people end up in situations they never planned. He frowned slightly. Everyone does. Kayla gave a quiet laugh. You're very calm about everything. It helps with my job. Or maybe it helps you ignore things. William set the bottle down. What are you talking about? Kayla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. Then she lowered her voice. You're not happy. Williams's expression tightened. That's not true. Kayla leaned back in the chair. Come on. She's my wife. That wasn't my question. The room grew quiet. Williams rubbed the back of his neck. You shouldn't say things like that. Why? Because they complicate things. Kayla watched him carefully. Things are already complicated. He didn't argue. Instead, he sat down across from her. What do you want me to say? Kayla's eyes softened slightly. Just be honest. Williams stared down at the table for a moment. I care about Eunice, he said finally. Kayla nodded. I know, but everything feels different lately. Because of the baby? Partly. He exhaled slowly. Responsibility changes people. Kayla studied him. You mean it scares you? Williams didn't respond. Kayla tapped her fingers lightly against the table. You know what I think? She said. What? I think you're the kind of man who wants control over his life. Williams looked up again. And sometimes people stay in situations because they feel like they have to. The words hung in the air. Williams's voice dropped slightly. You're talking about my marriage. Kayla didn't deny it. I'm talking about happiness. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The quiet house around them made the conversation feel heavier. Then Kayla stood up slowly. I should go. Williams didn't stop her. But as she walked toward the door, he said quietly, Kayla. She turned. Yes. He hesitated, then shook his head. Never mind. Kayla studied him for a second longer before opening the door and stepping outside. That conversation should have been the moment they both stepped back, the moment they recognized how dangerous the situation had become. Instead, it did the opposite. It made the unspoken thoughts between them louder. Over the next few weeks, their private conversations became more direct. They talked when Eunice wasn't in the room. Short exchanges at first, then longer ones. Kayla began asking questions that slowly shifted the direction of everything. What happens after the baby comes? What do you mean? You and Eunice. Your life. Williams would shrug. We raise our child. And the rest? What rest? Kayla leaned closer across the table one night. Do you see yourself living the same life 10 years from now? Williams didn't answer right away. Kayla continued quietly. Same house, same responsibilities, same routine. His silence told her more than words. Kayla sat back in the chair. You deserve more than a life that feels like obligation. Williams looked up sharply. She's not an obligation. Kayla raised her hands. I didn't say she was, but the idea had already entered the conversation. Once thoughts like that exist, they don't disappear easily. And Kayla was the kind of person who didn't stop once she started pushing toward something she wanted. The turning point came one evening when the conversation moved into darker territory. It happened while Eunice was visiting her mother for the afternoon. Kayla and Williams sat in the living room talking quietly. Have you ever thought about starting over? Kayla asked. Williams frowned. What does that mean? Leaving things behind that don't fit anymore. You're talking like this is simple. It could be. Williams laughed softly. No, it couldn't. Kayla leaned closer. What if it was? He studied her face carefully. You're serious. I always am. Williams stood up and walked toward the window. You're talking about destroying a marriage. Kayla didn't look away. I'm talking about choosing a future. Williams shook his head. You're not thinking clearly. Kayla's voice lowered. Actually, I am. There was something different in her tone now. Something colder. Something more determined. Eunice stands between us, she said. Williams turned around. Kayla, I'm just stating a fact. Stop. But Kayla continued. She has the house. She has the business. She has the life you're tied to. Williams stared at her. You sound crazy. Kayla tilted her head. Do the first. Then she said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. There are ways for people to disappear from situations. Williams felt a chill run down his spine. You need to stop talking. Kayla held his gaze. I'm just saying. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Sometimes problems get removed. Williams stared at her in disbelief. For the first time since their secret began, he truly saw something unsettling behind Kayla's confidence. Something dangerous. What are you suggesting? He asked quietly. Kayla didn't answer right away. She simply leaned back against the couch. And in that moment, the idea that would eventually lead to Eunice collapsing on her kitchen floor was spoken aloud for the very first time. After that conversation in the living room, something inside Kayla changed. Not all at once. There was no dramatic moment where she woke up one morning and decided to destroy someone's life. It happened slowly, the way dangerous thoughts often do. They settle in quietly. They sit in the back of your mind. And the longer they stay there, the more reasonable they start to sound. At first, Williams refused to entertain the idea. The next time Kayla hinted at it, he shut the conversation down immediately. Don't say things like that, he told her sharply. Kayla raised her hands in surrender. I was joking, but the look on her face said she hadn't been. Williams tried to ignore it. He threw himself into work at the hospital, volunteering for additional shifts and burying himself in patient charts. For a few days, it seemed like the tension between them might fade, but Kayla didn't let the subject disappear. She was patient. She knew pressure worked better when it came in small waves instead of one overwhelming push. One evening she arrived at the house carrying a bag of groceries. Eunice opened the door with a tired smile. "You keep doing this," Eunice said. "Doing what?" "Bringing food like I can't cook anymore." Kayla stepped inside. "You're pregnant. That means I get to spoil you." Eunice laughed and moved aside so she could enter. The house smelled faintly of lavender cleaning spray. A stack of paperwork sat on the dining table where Eunice had been working earlier. "You've been overworking again," Kayla said, eyeing the documents. "It's just scheduling." Kayla set the groceries on the counter and began unpacking them. Vegetables, soup containers, fruit. She moved around the kitchen easily, like someone who had spent years visiting this house. Eunice leaned against the counter watching her. "You don't have to do all this." Kayla smiled without looking up. "I know." She began chopping vegetables. The rhythm of the knife hitting the cutting board filled the kitchen. For a moment, everything felt normal. Just two friends preparing dinner together, the kind of quiet moment people rarely remember later. That's what made it so easy. While Eunice answered a phone call from one of her caregivers, Kayla reached into her purse sitting on the kitchen chair. Her fingers moved carefully, pulling out a small plastic bottle. It was unremarkable, clear, no label. Inside, a small amount of pale liquid rested at the bottom. Kayla's expression remained calm. She glanced toward the living room where Eunice was still talking on the phone. "Just move Mrs. Turner's appointment to Thursday," Eunice said. "I'll call her daughter and explain." Kayla turned back toward the stove. The soup simmered gently in the pot. She unscrewed the bottle cap. For half a second, she hesitated, not because she had changed her mind, but because she was calculating. The instructions she had read online had been very specific. Small amounts, too much too quickly would raise suspicion, but slow exposure could look like illness. Kayla tilted the bottle. A few drops slid into the soup. The liquid disappeared instantly. She replaced the cap and slipped the bottle back into her purse. By the time Eunice walked back into the kitchen, Kayla was stirring the pot like nothing had happened. "You still working?" Kayla asked. "Always," Eunice replied with a small smile. "Sit down," Kayla said. Eunice obeyed. Kayla poured a bowl of soup and placed it in front of her. "You're starting to look tired," Kayla added casually. Eunice sighed. "I've been feeling strange lately." Kayla tilted her head. "Strange how?" "Just weak sometimes." "That's normal during pregnancy," Kayla said quickly. Eunice nodded. "That's what the doctor said too." She picked up the spoon and took a bite. Kayla watched her carefully. Not obviously, just enough to see the first swallow. A quiet satisfaction settled in her chest. The plan had begun. Later that evening, Williams came home from the hospital. He walked into the kitchen loosening his tie. "Something smells good," he said. Kayla looked up from the sink. Soup. Eunice sat at the table finishing the last few bites. "You just missed it," she told him. Williams grabbed a glass of water. "Long day," he muttered. Kayla studied him for a moment. Their eyes met briefly, only for a second, but the look carried meaning. Something had started, something he still hadn't fully agreed to, but something he also hadn't stopped. Eunice pushed her bowl away and leaned back in her chair. "I'm exhausted," she said. "You should sleep," Williams replied gently. "I probably will." She stood slowly. Kayla immediately noticed the slight wobble in her movement. "Careful," she said quickly. Eunice laughed softly. "I'm fine," but she did place one hand on the counter for balance before walking toward the hallway. Williams watched her disappear into the bedroom. Then he turned toward Kayla. "What was that look earlier?" he asked quietly. Kayla dried her hands with a towel. "What look?" "You know what I mean." She leaned against the counter. "I was just saying hello." Williams didn't seem convinced. Something about her calmness unsettled him. "You need to drop that idea you mentioned before," he said. Kayla raised an eyebrow. "What idea?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about." Kayla shrugged. "You're imagining things." Williams studied her face. For a moment he considered pressing the conversation further, but the exhaustion from his shift weighed heavily on him. Finally, he sighed. "I'm going to shower." Kayla nodded. "Good night, Williams." He walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. The moment he disappeared, Kayla's expression changed. The calm friendliness faded slightly. In its place appeared something colder, more focused. She opened her purse again and looked briefly at the small bottle inside. Only a tiny amount had been used. There was plenty left. Plenty for many more visits. Kayla closed the purse and turned off the kitchen light. Down the hallway, Eunice was already asleep, completely unaware that the person she trusted most outside her family had just given her the first dose of poison. And the worst part was, the symptoms wouldn't appear all at once. They would arrive slowly, quietly, just like everything else that had been happening behind her back. At first, the changes in Eunice's body were small enough to ignore. Pregnancy came with all kinds of strange symptoms. Every book, every doctor, every older woman who had ever raised a child seemed to have a different story about what the body could do during those 9 months. So when Eunice woke up one morning feeling slightly dizzy, she didn't panic. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the room to steady. The sensation passed after a few seconds. "Probably stood up too fast," she murmured to herself. She moved slowly through the morning routine. Shower, breakfast, checking messages from caregivers who worked for her agency. But as the day continued, the weakness didn't fully disappear. By early afternoon, she felt the heaviness again. Not pain, exactly. Just a strange, draining sensation, like the energy was slowly leaking out of her muscles. When Williams came home later that evening, he noticed immediately. "You look pale," he said. Eunice was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing appointment notes. "I'm fine," she replied. "That's not convincing." She gave him a tired smile. "Pregnancy." Williams leaned against the counter. "Did you eat today?" "Twice." "What twice?" She pointed toward the sink. "Fruit and oatmeal." He shook his head. "You need real food. Doctor says small meals are fine." Williams walked over and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Still, I'd feel better if you rested." Eunice closed her laptop. "You sound like Kayla." Williams paused for a second. "Kayla said the same thing?" "Yesterday," Eunice said. "She came by and practically forced me to sit down while she made soup." Williams nodded slowly. "That was nice of her." Eunice smiled. "Kayla's always been like that." The following week, the symptoms grew more noticeable. Some mornings, Eunice woke up with a dull ache in her stomach. Other times, the dizziness returned without warning. Once, while standing in the shower, she had to brace her hand against the wall because her vision blurred for a moment. She mentioned it during her next prenatal appointment. The doctor reviewed her chart and asked a series of routine questions. "Any bleeding?" "No." "Fever?" "No." "Severe pain?" "Not really." The doctor nodded. "Pregnancy fatigue can intensify during the second trimester, especially if you're working a lot." Eunice sighed quietly. "So it's normal?" "It's common," the doctor said gently. "Just try to reduce stress where you can." Eunice laughed softly. "I run a business." "Then delegate more." Eunice promised she would. But when she returned home later that afternoon, the house already smelled like food. Kayla stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot. "You have a key now?" Eunice asked as she walked in. Kayla glanced over her shoulder. "You gave it to me 2 years ago." "Oh, right." Kayla turned back to the pot. "How was the appointment?" "Doctor says everything looks normal." "That's good." Eunice dropped her purse on the table and lowered herself into a chair. Kayla studied her briefly. "You still look tired." "I feel tired." Kayla poured a glass of juice and slid it across the table. "Drink that." Eunice obeyed. "You've become very bossy lately." Kayla smirked. "I'm keeping you alive." Eunice laughed softly. "If I didn't know you better, that would sound threatening." Kayla smiled, but the joke lingered longer in her mind than it should have. She served the soup again. Another bowl. Another quiet dose. Over the next several weeks, the pattern repeated itself. Kayla visited often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to check in. Each visit included food or drinks she prepared herself, and each time, a few more drops found their way into Eunice's meals. The toxin didn't work quickly. That was part of the plan. Slow exposure meant slow symptoms, and slow symptoms meant confusion. Eunice began mentioning her discomfort more frequently. One evening, she sat on the couch rubbing her stomach while Williams flipped through channels on the television. I feel strange again, she said quietly. Williams looked over immediately. What kind of strange? Like I'm weak. Do you want me to take you to the hospital? She shook her head. It passes after a while. Williams frowned. You've been saying that a lot lately. Eunice shrugged. Maybe pregnancy just hits people differently. Williams didn't look convinced. Maybe we should get another opinion. From who? A specialist. Eunice smiled faintly. You're being paranoid. But Williams couldn't shake the uneasy feeling building in his chest. He had spent years in hospitals. He knew how the body usually responded to pregnancy. Something about Eunice's symptoms didn't feel quite right. Later that week, Kayla stopped by again. Eunice answered the door slowly. You okay? Kayla asked immediately. Just tired. Kayla stepped inside. I told you to slow down. I did slow down. Kayla walked into the kitchen and began unpacking groceries again. Eunice sat at the table watching her. You're here more often than my own husband lately. Kayla laughed lightly. Well, someone has to keep you fed. The words were meant to sound caring, but they carried a darker truth Kayla never said out loud. Because every visit wasn't just helping Eunice. Every visit was another opportunity, another small dose, another step toward the outcome Kayla had imagined since the first time the idea crossed her mind. What she didn't realize was that the plan she believed was invisible was slowly creating a pattern someone else would eventually notice. Because toxins don't just weaken the body, they leave traces. And those traces would soon lead Dr. Carter to a discovery that would unravel everything. By the time Eunice reached her 6th month of pregnancy, even she could no longer ignore the way her body felt. The exhaustion had deepened into something heavier, not the kind of tiredness that disappears after a good night of sleep. This felt like her body was fighting something it couldn't name. Some mornings she woke up with a dull ache behind her eyes. Other days the dizziness came so suddenly she had to sit down wherever she happened to be standing. Still, she tried to keep life moving forward. Her business needed attention. Caregivers called daily with scheduling questions. Clients' families depended on her. And deep down, Eunice had always believed that pushing through discomfort was part of life. That belief had carried her through years of hard work. Now it kept her from questioning what was really happening. One evening she stood in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner. The sun had already disappeared behind the neighboring houses, leaving the room lit by the soft glow of the overhead light. A pot of rice simmered quietly on the stove. Eunice leaned one hand against the counter while stirring vegetables in a pan. The smell should have made her hungry. Instead, her stomach churned. She paused and closed her eyes for a moment. Just a second, she told herself. But when she opened them again, the room tilted slightly. She grabbed the edge of the counter. Okay, she whispered. The dizziness passed after a few seconds. Still, something about it felt different this time. Stronger, more sudden. She turned off the stove and lowered herself carefully into one of the kitchen chairs. The baby shifted gently inside her stomach. Eunice rested both hands over the small movement. You okay in there? She murmured. The front door opened a few minutes later. Williams stepped inside, loosening his tie the way he always did after long shifts. You cooking? He called from the hallway. In the kitchen, Eunice replied weakly. He walked in and immediately noticed the way she was sitting. Her shoulders were slumped slightly. Her face looked pale. Eunice? She forced a smile. I'm fine. Williams didn't believe it. You don't look fine. I just got dizzy again. Again? He repeated. Eunice nodded. It passed. Williams walked closer. How long has this been happening? A few weeks. He frowned. You told your doctor? Yes. And they said pregnancy can cause dizziness. Williams leaned his hands against the counter thinking. Something about the pattern bothered him more every day. Before he could respond, Eunice suddenly pressed her hand to her stomach. What is it? He asked quickly. She shook her head. Cramp? Bad? Just uncomfortable? Williams grabbed his phone. We're going to the hospital. No, Eunice said quickly. I'm not waiting. Williams. Her voice stopped mid-sentence. A sharp wave of dizziness hit her harder than anything she had felt before. The room spun violently. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor as she tried to stand. Then her knees buckled. Williams lunged forward just as her body collapsed. Eunice. She hit the floor before he could fully catch her. For a terrifying moment she didn't move. Williams dropped to his knees beside her. "Eunice, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered slightly. Her breathing came in shallow bursts. "Baby," she whispered weakly. Williams grabbed his phone with shaking hands. "Stay with me," he said urgently. He dialed emergency services. "Yes, my wife collapsed. She's pregnant. 6 months." He gave the address while kneeling beside her. Eunice's fingers twitched slightly against the tile floor. Williams pressed his hand against her shoulder. "You're going to be okay," he said. But his voice didn't sound steady. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens echoed down the street. Neighbors' porch lights flicked on as the ambulance pulled into the driveway. Paramedics rushed through the front door carrying equipment. One of them knelt beside Eunice immediately. "6 months pregnant?" he asked. Williams nodded quickly. "She's been dizzy all week." The paramedic checked her pulse. "Let's move fast." They carefully lifted Eunice onto the stretcher. Her head rolled slightly to the side as they secured the straps. Williams followed them out to the ambulance. Inside, the paramedics worked quickly. Blood pressure monitor, oxygen mask, questions. "When did symptoms start?" "A few weeks ago." "Any medications?" "Just prenatal vitamins." Eunice drifted in and out of consciousness as the ambulance sped toward the hospital. Williams sat beside her, gripping the edge of the seat. The flashing lights outside reflected through the ambulance windows. For the first time since this entire situation began, fear settled heavily in his chest. Not just fear for Eunice, fear of something else. Because deep down, he knew something no one else in that ambulance knew yet. Something Kayla had started. Something he had never fully stopped. When the ambulance doors burst open at the hospital entrance, the emergency team was already waiting. They rushed Eunice inside. Bright lights, shouting voices, doctors moving quickly. Among them was a physician stepping into the trauma room after finishing another case. Dr. Carter. He watched the paramedics roll Eunice in and began issuing instructions immediately. Vitals, blood work, fetal monitor. The room moved with practiced urgency. Minutes later, Eunice lay unconscious in the hospital bed while machines tracked her heartbeat and the baby's. William stood just outside the room watching everything unfold. His hands were clasped tightly together, his eyes fixed on the floor. Inside the room, Dr. Carter reviewed the first lab results arriving from the testing department. He frowned slightly. Something in the toxicology panel caught his attention. He leaned closer to the screen. Then, he checked it again. The same result appeared. A rare toxin, present in Eunice's bloodstream. Dr. Carter slowly leaned back. Poison. Someone had been poisoning a pregnant woman. And as he stepped out of the room, his eyes landed on the man standing alone in the hallway. Williams. For a brief moment their eyes met, and something about the look on Williams' face didn't feel like the reaction of a shocked husband. It felt like the reaction of someone realizing a secret had just begun to unravel. The same secret that had started weeks earlier, with a small bottle hidden inside Kayla's purse. Dr. Carter had been practicing medicine long enough to recognize when something didn't make sense. Medicine, at its core, was pattern recognition. Doctors studied symptoms, lab results, and patient history, then compared them to thousands of cases they had seen before. Most of the time, the patterns lined up. But sometimes they didn't. And when they didn't, it meant something important was being missed. Dr. Carter stood in front of the computer screen in the nurse's station, the toxicology report still open in front of him. He read it again slowly. Then again. The numbers didn't change. A trace toxin had been detected in Eunice's bloodstream. It wasn't something commonly found in household products. It wasn't a typical medication ingredient either. It was the kind of chemical that appeared when someone had been exposed deliberately, which meant this wasn't a random pregnancy complication. Dr. Carter leaned back slightly in his chair, rubbing his chin while thinking. Across the hallway, Eunice lay unconscious in the emergency room bed, while nurses monitored her and the baby. Through the open doorway, he could hear the fetal monitor beeping steadily. The baby's heart rate was stable. That was the one piece of good news so far. But the toxin level worried him. Not because it was high, because it wasn't. The amount in her system was small, too small to cause sudden death, but enough to cause weakness, dizziness, gradual physical decline. That kind of dosage pattern suggested repeated exposure over time, which meant the poison likely hadn't come from a single event. It had been building. Dr. Carter picked up the printed report and walked back toward Eunice's room. Inside, a nurse was adjusting the IV drip while checking the monitor. "How's she doing?" he asked quietly. "Vitals are stabilizing," the nurse replied. "Baby's heartbeat is strong." "Doctor?" Carter nodded. "That's good." He walked to the side of the bed and looked down at Eunice. Her face looked peaceful in sleep, though the exhaustion in her features told a different story. Pregnancy had already placed stress on her body. The toxin had made it worse. He checked the chart attached to the bed. 28 years old, 6 months pregnant, no major medical history. He flipped through the recent test results again. Everything else looked normal, which brought his thoughts back to the same unsettling conclusion. Someone had been poisoning her. Dr. Carter stepped back into the hallway where Williams still stood. The man hadn't moved much since Eunice had been brought in. He looked up when Dr. Carter approached. "How is she?" Williams asked immediately. "Stable for now," Dr. Carter replied. Williams exhaled quietly. "And the baby?" "The baby's heart rate is strong." Relief flickered across Williams's face. Dr. Carter studied him carefully. "Mr. Williams, I need to ask you a few questions." "Of course. Has your wife been exposed to anything unusual recently?" Williams frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Any chemicals, new medications, herbal supplements?" Williams shook his head. "No." Dr. Carter held the lab report at his side. "What about food or drinks she's been consuming regularly?" Williams hesitated for a moment. "Nothing unusual." Dr. Carter watched him closely. "Has she complained about feeling unwell recently?" "Yes," Williams said quickly. "Dizziness, weakness. We thought it was pregnancy symptoms." Dr. Carter nodded slowly. "That's a common assumption." Williams shifted slightly. "Why are you asking?" Dr. Carter chose his words carefully. "There are traces of a toxin in your wife's bloodstream." Williams blinked. "A toxin?" "Yes." The hallway seemed to grow heavier with the word. "What kind of toxin?" Williams asked. "We're still analyzing the source." Williams ran a hand through his hair. "That doesn't make sense." Dr. Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked another question. "Who prepares most of the meals in your home?" Williams thought for a second. "Sometimes Eunice, sometimes me, and sometimes our friend Kayla when she visits." "Doctor," Carter noticed the name. "Kayla?" "Her best friend," Williams said. "She's been helping out during the pregnancy." "Doctor," Carter nodded, though he didn't comment. "How often does she visit?" "Several times a week." "And she cooks for Eunice?" "Sometimes." Dr. Carter thanked him and stepped away toward the nurse's station again. His mind had already begun forming a timeline. Repeated toxin exposure, symptoms appearing over weeks, meals prepared by someone who visited regularly. None of it proved anything yet, but the pattern was becoming clearer. He picked up the phone on the desk. "Security," he said when someone answered. "This is Dr. Carter in emergency. I need someone from hospital administration to come down." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Is there a problem?" Dr. Carter glanced once more toward Eunice's room. "Yes," he said quietly. "There might be." When he hung up the phone, he opened Eunice's chart again and began documenting every symptom she had reported. Dizziness, weakness, fatigue, gradual progression over several weeks. Then he added the toxicology results. Because if someone had truly been poisoning a pregnant woman, this situation was no longer just a medical emergency. It was a criminal investigation waiting to begin. The emergency room had settled into its usual rhythm again. Phones rang at the nurse's station. A patient in another room complained loudly about the wait time. Somewhere down the hallway, a monitor beeped steadily until a nurse silenced it. But inside Dr. Carter's mind, the situation with Eunice refused to settle. He stood at the nurse's station reviewing her chart again, while hospital administration and security quietly began the process he had requested. Hospitals had procedures for situations like this, rare situations, but not unheard of. When a doctor suspected a patient had been deliberately harmed, they were required to document everything carefully and notify hospital security and local authorities, because poisoning wasn't just a medical issue. It was a crime. Dr. Carter finished typing a note in the patient chart when a middle-aged man in a dark jacket approached the desk. "Dr. Carter?" the man asked. "Yes, I'm Marcus Reed from hospital security." "Doctor." Carter nodded. "Thank you for coming." Reed glanced toward Eunice's room. What exactly are we dealing with? Dr. Carter handed him a copy of the toxicology report. Trace levels of a toxin. Reed studied the page briefly. Accidental exposure? Highly unlikely, Dr. Carter said. Why? The chemical isn't something people encounter in normal household environments. Reed folded the paper slowly. So you're saying someone gave it to her? That's my concern. Reed looked toward the hallway where Williams still waited in a chair. Family? Husband, Dr. Carter replied. Reed nodded thoughtfully. Have you spoken to him? Yes. And? He says the symptoms started weeks ago. Reed exhaled quietly. That fits the slow exposure pattern. Dr. Carter glanced toward Eunice's room again. She's 6 months pregnant. Reed nodded grimly. Which makes this a whole different level of serious. Within 30 minutes, 2 police detectives arrived at the hospital. They spoke quietly with Dr. Carter and Marcus Reed in a small office near the emergency department. Detective Alicia Grant leaned forward in her chair while reviewing the toxicology report. You're certain about this? She asked. Dr. Carter nodded. The lab confirmed it twice. And the symptoms match long-term exposure? Yes. Grant looked at her partner, Detective Samuel Brooks. Brooks sighed. So someone's been slowly poisoning a pregnant woman. That's what the evidence suggests, Dr. Carter said. Grant tapped the report with her pen. What's the toxin? A rare compound used in small-scale agricultural chemicals in certain industrial applications. Brooks raised an eyebrow. Not something people usually keep in their kitchen. Exactly. Grant closed the folder. All right. She stood up. Let's start with the husband. They stepped into the hallway where Williams was still seated near Eunice's room. He stood when he saw the detectives approaching. Is something wrong? He asked. Detective Grant introduced herself calmly. Mr. Williams, we'd like to ask you a few questions. Williams looked confused. About what? Your wife's condition. He nodded. Of course. They moved to a quieter corner of the hallway. Grant opened a small notebook. Dr. Carter told us your wife has been experiencing symptoms for several weeks. Yes. What kind of symptoms? Dizziness. Weakness. Grant wrote the information down. Did she ever mention being exposed to chemicals or anything unusual? No. Brooks spoke next. Who spends the most time with her at home? Williams answered without hesitation. Me. And anyone else? Williams paused slightly. Her friend Kayla. Grant looked up. How often does this friend visit? 2 or 3 times a week. And she prepares food? Sometimes. Grant and Brooks exchanged a quick glance. Brooks continued. Does Kayla have access to the house? Yes. She has a key. Grant wrote the information carefully. Mr. Williams, we're going to ask you something directly. Williams shifted uncomfortably. Okay. Grant's voice remained calm but firm. The lab results show a toxin in your wife's bloodstream. Williams froze. A toxin? Yes. The words seemed to hang in the air between them. Brooks spoke next. The levels suggest repeated exposure over time. Williams ran his hand across his forehead. That can't be right. Grant watched his reaction closely. Do you know anyone who would want to harm your wife? Williams shook his head quickly. No. Any conflicts, financial disputes, family problems? No. Grant closed the notebook. All right. But something about Williams' body language had shifted. His shoulders looked tense. His eyes avoided hers more often. Detectives spent years learning to recognize those subtle signals. Grant wasn't ready to draw conclusions yet. But the discomfort was noticeable. Mr. Williams, Brooks said calmly, we may need to follow up with anyone who's been in close contact with your wife recently. Williams nodded slowly. Of course. Starting with this friend, Grant added. Kayla. Williams hesitated again. Just long enough for the detectives to notice. Yes, he said quietly. Kayla. Meanwhile, down the hallway inside Eunice's hospital room, the machines continued monitoring her and the baby. Her breathing had steadied. Her pulse was improving, but the poison was still inside her body. And outside that room, the investigation was beginning to move in a direction no one involved had expected. Because the more the detectives looked at the pattern of exposure, the more it pointed towards someone who had been welcomed into Eunice's home, someone who had cooked her meals, someone she trusted completely. And before long, that trail would lead directly to Kayla. The hospital hallway felt colder than it had earlier that night, not because the temperature had changed, but because the situation had shifted from uncertainty to suspicion. Detective Alicia Grant leaned against the counter at the nurse's station, while Detective Samuel Brooks spoke quietly with Marcus Reed from hospital security. They had already requested copies of Eunice's lab results and admission notes. Now they needed something else, a timeline. Because investigations rarely began with a single dramatic discovery, they began with patterns, small details that eventually lined up into something undeniable. Grant flipped open her notebook again. "Let's walk through this slowly," she said to Brooks. 6 months pregnant. Symptoms started several weeks ago. Gradual decline in strength. Brooks nodded. And the toxicology shows repeated exposure. Grant tapped the pen against the page thoughtfully. That means the toxin was likely administered multiple times. Brooks crossed his arms, which means whoever did this had consistent access. Grant looked toward Eunice's hospital room, then back toward the hallway where Williams had been speaking with a nurse. He mentioned someone who visits regularly. "Kayla," Brooks said. Grant nodded. "And she cooks," Brooks exhaled slowly, which puts her pretty close to the situation. Grant closed the notebook. "We'll need to talk to her." Across the hallway, Williams stood near the vending machines, staring blankly at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The detectives approached again. Grant spoke calmly. "Mr. Williams, we'll need Kayla's full name and contact information." Williams blinked. "Right now?" "Yes." Williams hesitated. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through his contacts. "Kayla Johnson," he said. He read the phone number aloud while Grant wrote it down. Brooks studied him carefully. "Is Kayla aware your wife is in the hospital?" "No." "Why not?" Williams shrugged weakly. "It happened fast." Grant closed the notebook. "We'll be contacting her tonight." Williams nodded slowly, but something inside his chest tightened, because the moment Kayla realized the hospital had run toxicology tests, everything would change. Several miles away, Kayla sat in her apartment scrolling through her phone. The television played quietly in the background, though she wasn't really watching it. She had spent most of the evening thinking about the last time she saw Eunice, about how weak Eunice had looked, about the way the dizziness had gotten worse recently. Kayla had expected that. The toxin had been working exactly the way the instructions described. Slow exposure, gradual decline, illness that looked natural. She reached for the small bottle sitting inside her purse on the coffee table. There wasn't much left. Only a thin layer of liquid remained. Kayla studied it for a moment. "Almost done," she murmured. Her phone vibrated suddenly on the table. The screen lit up. Unknown number. Kayla frowned slightly but answered. "Hello?" A calm voice responded. "Is this Kayla Johnson?" "Yes. This is Detective Alicia Grant with Atlanta Police." Kayla's posture straightened instantly. "I'm sorry. What?" "We're calling regarding Eunice Williams." Kayla's heart skipped. "What about her?" "She was admitted to the hospital earlier tonight." Kayla stood up quickly. "What happened?" "She collapsed." Kayla's voice filled with practiced concern. "Oh my God. Is she okay?" "She's stable," Grant replied. "But we'd like to ask you a few questions." Kayla's mind began racing. "Questions? About what?" Still, her voice remained steady. "Of course. What do you need to know?" Grant paused briefly before speaking again. Dr. Carter discovered something unusual in Eunice's blood work. Kayla felt a sudden chill crawl across her spine. "What do you mean?" "A toxin." The word landed like a hammer. Kayla didn't respond immediately. Grant continued calmly. "The levels suggest she's been exposed multiple times over several weeks." Kayla forced herself to breathe normally. "That's impossible." "We're still investigating," Grant said. "But Mr. Williams mentioned you visit frequently and sometimes prepare meals." Kayla's grip tightened around the phone. "Yes, I help her sometimes. We'd appreciate it if you could come to the hospital to answer a few questions." Kayla swallowed. "Right now?" "Yes." Kayla stared at the purse sitting on the coffee table, the small bottle still hidden inside. For the first time since she began the plan, fear began creeping into her thoughts. Had she made a mistake? Had something been detected earlier than expected? Her voice finally returned. "I'll be there soon." "Thank you," Grant said. The call ended. Kayla stood frozen in the middle of her living room. Her eyes drifted slowly toward the purse, toward the bottle, toward the evidence she hadn't expected anyone to discover. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Eunice stirred slightly in her bed. Lorraine had just arrived and sat quietly beside her daughter, holding her hand. Dr. Carter checked the monitors again. The baby's heartbeat remained steady. For now, both of them were still alive. But outside that hospital room, the truth was beginning to surface piece by piece. And very soon, Kayla would walk into the building believing she could still control the situation. She had no idea that the investigation waiting for her inside was already closing in. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of machines. A monitor beside the bed beeped softly, tracking Eunice's pulse. Another device monitored the baby's heartbeat, the faint but steady thump echoing every few seconds through the room. Lorraine sat in the chair beside the bed, both hands wrapped around Eunice's fingers. She hadn't let go since she arrived. Lorraine had seen hospitals before. She had spent years cleaning their hallways and patient rooms during night shifts when Eunice was growing up. She knew the smell of antiseptic, the hum of fluorescent lights, the tension that filled the air when something serious had happened. But this felt different. This wasn't someone else's child lying in that bed. It was hers. Eunice stirred slightly. Lorraine leaned forward immediately. Baby? Eunice's eyelids fluttered. For a moment, everything looked blurry. The ceiling lights, the white walls, the machines surrounding her. Her mind struggled to catch up with what her body had already been through. Mom? She whispered weakly. Lorraine's eyes filled with relief. Yes, baby. I'm right here. Eunice blinked slowly. What happened? Lorraine squeezed her hand gently. You collapsed at home. The memory returned in fragments. The kitchen. The dizziness. Williams shouting her name. The floor rushing up toward her. Eunice turned her head slightly. Where's Williams? Lorraine hesitated for just a moment. He's here, in the hospital. Eunice nodded faintly. Then she placed a hand against her stomach. The baby. Lorraine smiled softly through tears. Still fighting. Strong heartbeat. Eunice closed her eyes for a moment, as relief washed through her. A soft knock sounded at the door. Dr. Carter stepped inside with a calm expression. How are we feeling? He asked gently. Eunice turned her head toward him. Tired. That's understandable. He checked the monitors quickly while speaking. Your body went through a lot tonight. Eunice studied his face. What caused it? Doctor? Carter paused. He had already spoken with the detectives. But delivering news like this to a patient required care, especially when that patient was pregnant. Lorraine noticed the hesitation. What is it? She asked. Dr. Carter looked at Eunice. There's something we need to discuss. Eunice's stomach tightened slightly. What? Dr. Carter pulled a chair closer to the bed. When you arrived tonight, we ran several tests. Eunice nodded slowly. One of those tests was toxicology. Lorraine frowned. Toxicology? Dr. Carter spoke carefully. It detects harmful substances in the bloodstream. Eunice felt a strange chill run through her. And Dr. Carter held her gaze. We found traces of a toxin in your system. The words didn't register immediately. A toxin? Eunice repeated. Yes. Lorraine looked stunned. How would something like that get into her body? Doctor. Carter took a breath. That's the question investigators are trying to answer. Eunice stared at him. Investigators? Police are involved. The room seemed to tilt slightly again, though this time it wasn't dizziness. It was disbelief. You're saying someone poisoned me? Eunice asked quietly. Dr. Carter nodded. The toxin levels suggest repeated exposure over several weeks. Lorraine's hand tightened around Eunice's. That's impossible, Lorraine said. But even as she spoke the words, fear crept into her voice. Because repeated exposure meant something terrifying. It meant whoever did this had been close enough to Eunice to do it more than once. Eunice's thoughts began racing. Weeks. The dizziness. The weakness. Her eyes slowly filled with realization. Someone's been giving it to me? She whispered. Dr. Carter nodded gently. That appears to be the case. Silence settled over the room. Not the calm kind. The heavy kind that comes when a person's understanding of their own life suddenly breaks apart. Eunice stared at the ceiling. Her mind moved through the past several weeks. The meals, the visits, the people who had been around her. And there weren't many. Williams. Kayla. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Who would do that? Dr. Carter didn't answer directly. The police are speaking with people who have been around you recently. Lorraine's expression hardened. You mean someone she knows, Doctor? Carter didn't disagree. Just then, the door opened again. Detective Alicia Grant stepped inside. Behind her stood Detective Samuel Brooks. Grant gave a small, respectful nod. Miss Eunice, I'm sorry to bother you while you're recovering. Eunice turned toward them slowly. What's happening? Grant spoke calmly. We're investigating how the toxin entered your system. Lorraine folded her arms protectively. My daughter needs rest. We understand, Grant said, but there are some questions that may help us stop whoever did this. Eunice swallowed. Okay. Grant stepped closer to the bed. Over the past several weeks, who has been preparing food or drinks for you regularly? Eunice thought carefully. Sometimes Williams. Grant nodded. And anyone else? Eunice hesitated. Then she answered, my best friend. What's her name? Eunice's voice softened slightly. Kayla. Detective Brooks exchanged a glance with Grant. Grant wrote the name down in her notebook. Kayla Johnson? She asked. Eunice looked surprised. Yes. Grant closed the notebook slowly. Miss Eunice. Kayla is actually on her way to the hospital right now. Eunice blinked. She is? Yes. Grant met her eyes carefully. Because she's one of the last people known to have been around you before your symptoms worsened. The realization hadn't fully formed yet. But something about the way the detective said the words made Eunice's stomach tighten again. Not because she believed Kayla would harm her, but because the world suddenly felt far less safe than it had a few hours ago. Outside the hospital room, down the long hallway toward the elevators, Kayla stepped inside the building. Her purse still hung over her shoulder. And inside that purse, the small bottle containing the remaining poison was still there. She believed she had come to answer a few questions. She had no idea the truth waiting inside that hospital room was about to tear every relationship in Eunice's life apart. The hospital elevators opened with a quiet chime. Kayla stepped out and followed the signs toward the emergency wing, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee from a vending machine nearby. She had been in hospitals before, but tonight felt different. Her chest felt tight in a way she couldn't fully control. Not panic, not yet, but something close to it. She adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder as she approached the nurse's station. A nurse looked up. Can I help you? Yes, Kayla said, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm here to see Eunice Williams. Detective Grant asked me to come. The nurse nodded toward the seating area. They'll be with you in just a moment. Kayla sat down. Her eyes scanned the hallway instinctively. That's when she saw Williams. He stood near the far wall, speaking quietly with Detective Brooks. For a moment, their eyes met. Williams looked pale, tense. Kayla tried to read his expression, but he looked away quickly. Something inside her stomach twisted. The situation already felt wrong. Before she could think further, Detective Grant approached her. Kayla Johnson? Kayla stood. Yes. Grant offered a small professional smile. Thank you for coming. Of course, Kayla replied. How's Eunice? She's stable, Grant said. Kayla nodded with visible relief. That's good. Grant gestured toward a small consultation room down the hallway. Let's talk in here. Kayla followed her inside. Detective Brooks joined them a moment later and closed the door. The room was simple. A table, 3 chairs, fluorescent lighting overhead. Kayla sat down slowly. Grant opened a folder in front of her. You and Eunice have been friends for a long time? Grant asked. Since college, Kayla replied. So more than 10 years? Yes. And you've been helping her during the pregnancy? Kayla nodded. She gets tired easily. What kind of help do you usually provide? Kayla shrugged. Cooking sometimes, cleaning a little, just normal friend stuff. Grant wrote something down. How often would you say you visited Eunice in the past month? Maybe 2 or 3 times a week. Brooks leaned forward slightly. And during those visits, did you prepare meals? Yes. Grant looked up. Soup? Kayla blinked. Sometimes. Grant slid a piece of paper across the table. It was the toxicology report. Kayla's eyes scanned it quickly, though she pretended not to understand it. "What is this?" she asked. "Lab results," Grant said calmly. Kayla looked back at her. "And?" Grant's voice remained steady. "The toxin detected in Eunice's bloodstream can be administered in liquid form." Kayla's heart pounded once against her ribs, but her face stayed neutral. "I don't know anything about toxins." Grant watched her carefully. "Of course." She flipped another page in the folder. "Our concern is the repeated exposure." Kayla folded her arms. "I already told you I don't know anything about that." Brooks spoke quietly. "The toxin appears in small doses over time." Grant continued. "Which means someone had consistent access to Eunice's food." Kayla shifted in her chair. "Lots of people could have access." Grant nodded slowly. "Possibly." Then she leaned slightly closer. "But most of them don't have a reason." Kayla's voice sharpened slightly. "Are you accusing me of something?" Grant held her gaze. "We're investigating." The room went silent. Kayla leaned back in the chair and crossed her legs. "This is ridiculous." Grant didn't respond immediately. Instead, she asked a different question. "How would you describe your relationship with Williams?" Kayla felt the question hit like a sudden drop in temperature. "My relationship with Williams?" "Yes." Kayla forced a small laugh. "He's my best friend's husband." Grant studied her. "Nothing more?" Kayla shook her head. "No." Grant glanced briefly at Brooks. Then she opened another folder and slid a printed page across the table. "Phone records." Kayla's stomach tightened. "These are phone logs," Grant said calmly. "They show hundreds of text messages exchanged between you and Williams over the past 3 months." Kayla's mind raced. Friends text. That's normal. But the number. The detectives were watching her closely now. Brooks spoke again. "Some of these messages were sent late at night." Grant added quietly. After Eunice had gone to bed. Kayla's fingers tightened slightly against the table. Still, she kept her voice steady. "So what?" Grant leaned forward. "Kayla." The way she said the name carried a weight now. "We're trying to understand what happened." Kayla stared back at her. "I've told you everything I know." Grant sat back slowly. "All right." She closed the folder. "Then maybe you won't mind if we speak with Eunice together." Kayla frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Grant stood up. "Eunice is awake." Kayla's chest tightened again. "And she's asked to see you." The words landed like a quiet shock. Kayla hadn't expected that. She stood slowly. "Okay." Grant gestured toward the hallway. "Right this way." They walked toward Eunice's hospital room. Each step down the corridor seemed louder than the last. Inside the room, Lorraine still sat beside the bed. Dr. Carter stood near the monitor checking the baby's heartbeat. And Eunice lay against the pillows, pale but conscious. When the door opened, Eunice turned her head. Her eyes landed on Kayla. For a brief moment, the room felt like it held its breath. Kayla stepped forward slowly. Concern spread across her face. "Eunice," she said softly. "Oh my God. I was so worried." Eunice stared at her, not angry, not accusing, just searching. The detectives waited quietly behind them. Eunice's voice was weak but steady. "Kayla." Kayla reached for her hand. "What happened to you?" Eunice held her gaze. And then she asked the question that would shatter everything. "Did you know someone's been poisoning me?" Kayla froze. For a moment, no one in the hospital room moved. Kayla stood beside the bed, Eunice's question hanging in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. "Did you know someone's been poisoning me?" Kayla's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her purse. "What?" she said softly. Her voice carried the right amount of confusion, the right amount of shock, but something about the pause before she answered made Detective Grant's eyes narrow just slightly. Eunice watched Kayla carefully. For years she had known this woman's expressions, her habits, the small changes in her voice when she was joking, when she was upset, when she was hiding something minor like forgetting a birthday gift. But now she was searching Kayla's face like someone trying to read a stranger. "They found something in my blood," Eunice continued quietly. "A toxin." Kayla shook her head quickly. "That's crazy." Her voice grew louder. "Who would do something like that?" Detective Brooks stepped forward slightly. "That's exactly what we're trying to figure out." Kayla turned toward him. Then, why am I here? Grant answered calmly. Because you've been around Eunice frequently during the time she was exposed. Kayla scoffed. So now helping my best friend makes me suspicious? Lorraine spoke from the chair beside the bed. Watch your tone. Kayla glanced at her but said nothing. Eunice still hadn't looked away from her. Kayla, Eunice said softly. They said whoever did this had access to my food. Kayla laughed under her breath. So what? I cooked soup a few times. That doesn't mean anything. Grant took another step forward. Actually, it means quite a bit. Kayla turned toward her again. Oh, really? Grant opened a folder. We've reviewed your phone records. Kayla's jaw tightened. And? Grant flipped to another page. Hundreds of messages between you and Williams. Kayla's eyes flickered toward the corner of the room. Williams stood there now. He had entered quietly a few minutes earlier, but hadn't spoken yet. Eunice hadn't noticed him until that moment. Her head turned slowly. Williams? The room grew even heavier. Williams couldn't meet her eyes. Kayla spoke quickly. We're friends. Of course, we text. Grant nodded slightly. Yes. Friends. She placed another printed page on the bed tray in front of Eunice. Screenshots of messages. Some were harmless, but others. Eunice's eyes moved slowly across the page. Her heart began pounding harder with every line. Kayla, she doesn't understand you the way I do. Williams, this situation is complicated. Kayla, it wouldn't be if things were different. Eunice felt the air leave her lungs. She looked up at Williams. What is this? Williams remained silent. Kayla spoke again, faster now. They're twisting things. Grant's voice cut in quietly. Kayla. She reached into the folder one last time. And then there's this. Grant placed a clear evidence bag on the tray. Inside it sat the small plastic bottle. Kayla's breath caught. Police had taken it from her purse when she entered the hospital. The same purse she had been carrying since the moment she arrived. Grant spoke calmly. This was found in your bag. Kayla's voice cracked slightly. I don't know what that is. Doctor, Carter stepped forward. It contains the same compound detected in Eunice's bloodstream. Kayla's composure began to fracture. That doesn't prove anything. Grant met her eyes. It proves a lot. The room felt smaller now. Williams finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Kayla. She turned toward him sharply. Don't. But it was too late. The weight of everything had finally reached him. Williams ran a hand over his face. I never thought it would go this far, he said quietly. Eunice stared at him. What are you talking about? Williams finally looked at her. And in that moment, Eunice saw something she had never seen before. Guilt. Real, heavy guilt. Kayla's voice rose suddenly. Williams, shut up. But he continued. I told her it was a bad idea. Eunice's heart dropped. A bad idea? Kayla stepped forward angrily. Don't you dare do this. Grant raised a hand. That's enough. But the truth had already cracked open. Williams looked at Eunice again. I didn't know she had already started. Kayla laughed bitterly. Oh, now you want to pretend you're innocent? Lorraine stood up from her chair. You tried to kill my daughter. Kayla's voice turned cold. She was standing in the way. The words landed like a physical blow. Eunice felt her chest tighten. In the way of what? She whispered. Kayla looked directly at her. Our future. Eunice's mind struggled to process the sentence. Our. Her eyes shifted toward Williams. He couldn't say the words, but he didn't deny them either. The silence was answer enough. For a moment, Eunice didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears yet. The betrayal sat heavy in her chest like something frozen. Detective Brooks stepped forward. Kayla Johnson, you're under arrest for attempted murder. Kayla didn't resist when the handcuffs closed around her wrists. She only stared at Eunice one last time. You would have never understood, she said quietly. Then the detectives led her out of the room. Williams remained standing in the corner. Eunice finally looked at him again. You too? She asked softly. Williams shook his head weakly. I never wanted. Stop. Her voice, though quiet, carried a firmness he had never heard before. Just stop. Lorraine placed her hand gently on Eunice's shoulder. Williams looked like he wanted to say something else, but the room had already given him his answer. He turned and walked out slowly. The door closed behind him. The machines continued their quiet rhythm beside the bed. For a long time, Eunice simply stared at the ceiling. Then, finally, the tears came. Months later, when Eunice held her newborn daughter in her arms for the first time, Dr. Carter stood quietly near the doorway. The baby was small but healthy. Lorraine wiped tears from her face. Eunice looked down at the tiny fingers wrapped around her own. So much had been taken from her. Her marriage, her trust, her closest friendship, but something else had survived. Life. Dr. Carter smiled gently. "She's strong," he said. Eunice nodded softly. "She'll need to be." Years later, when people asked Eunice how she managed to rebuild her life after everything that happened, she would say something simple. "Betrayal hurts," she told them. "But sometimes betrayal reveals who was never truly walking beside you." She raised her daughter surrounded by family who loved her. Her business grew stronger, and the lesson she carried forward was one she never forgot. Trust is powerful, but self-respect is stronger, because the people who truly belong in your life will never need you to disappear just so they can live comfortably. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you were in Eunice's position, if the two people you trusted the most betrayed you like that, do you think you could ever forgive them? Some betrayals don't just hurt in the moment. They change the way you see people, the way you trust, the way you move through life. But Eunice's story also reminds us of something powerful. Sometimes the people who try to break you end up revealing the strength you didn't know you had. So, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Eunice's place? Would you have confronted them the same way? Would you have walked away forever? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Mr. Graham Stories so you don't miss the next one. Because every story we share here is about real life, real choices, and the lessons we carry forward.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.